Imagine a time when America was the undisputed leader of the world, the heart of innovation, and the pride of global agriculture. Then a storm started brewing. John Deere, the iconic symbol of American farming, made a bold move that shook the core of Trump's America First vision. They decided to move some of their production to Mexico, looking for cheaper labor and greater global reach. The response was swift and loud. A 200% tariff on anything John Deere made across the border. But here's the catch. Trump's threat wasn't just a political jab. It was a blow to the very heart of American business, causing an uproar among manufacturers and workers. Trump's fierce rhetoric made it sound like a betrayal to American values, as John Deere, a household name for decades, began outsourcing production. The message was clear. If you move your production out of America, you will face severe consequences. Yet, what did John Deere do in the face of this threat? They stood their ground. The company's leaders made it clear they weren't running away. Their move to Mexico wasn't about abandoning America. It was about survival in an increasingly competitive world. They knew that with rising labor costs in the U.S., Mexico was an opportunity to remain cost competitive and to push into emerging markets in countries like Brazil, India, and China, where demand for agricultural equipment was soaring. This wasn't just a simple corporate decision. It was a fundamental shift in the global economic order. John Deere wasn't simply responding to rising costs. They were positioning themselves to thrive in the future. Yet this shift didn't come without consequences. Trump's tariff threats were a stark reminder of the growing tensions between global trade and the traditional American economy. As John Deere pushed forward, they challenged a status quo that many feared would not survive the coming wave of change. And then, the stakes became even higher. The battle wasn't just about John Deere. It was about the future of American manufacturing, about whether protectionist policies could really shield American jobs from the inevitable forces of global competition. Could the U.S. afford to isolate itself from the world, or would it need to embrace change, however uncomfortable, in order to survive? Trump was betting on the first option, that tariffs could shield America from the global market forces that were reshaping industries. But John Deere and others like it showed that survival in a global economy meant adapting, not clinging to the past. The truth was clear. If the U.S. didn't change with the times, it risked falling behind. But could Trump see that? Or would his stubborn protectionism push the American economy into an irreversible decline? This is where things took a dark turn, not just for John Deere, but for the entire agricultural sector. The tariffs Trump imposed weren't just hitting John Deere. They were hitting American farmers, workers, and consumers, who would ultimately pay the price for these protectionist policies. If companies like John Deere were forced to pay such a high price to produce goods, what would that mean for the cost of food and agricultural products in the U.S.? As the battle between John Deere and Trump raged on, it became clear that this wasn't just a corporate showdown. This was a fight that would have far-reaching consequences for the entire U.S. economy and the world at large. Trump's decision to impose tariffs on companies that move production abroad wasn't just about punishing John Deere. It was a declaration of his America First strategy. But what Trump failed to consider was that the global economy wasn't simply going to sit back and let America dictate the rules. Let's talk about the European Union, which initially stood firm against Trump's tariffs. Leaders like Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission, spoke out passionately, warning of a global economic collapse if Trump's trade policies were allowed to dominate. They threatened countermeasures, hoping to protect their interests and businesses. But then, just days later, something unexpected happened. The EU made a sharp U-turn. The EU, once defiant, agreed to negotiate with Trump. They even offered a zero-for-zero tariff proposal, effectively conceding ground. It was a complete reversal that left many shocked. Was this the moment when Trump truly won the battle? The world had been watching, and the EU's sudden change of heart showed that, when pushed to the limit, even the strongest allies could bend. This unexpected shift wasn't just a diplomatic failure for the EU, it was proof of Trump's unyielding resolve and ability to sway global leaders. But more importantly, it illustrated the fragility of international trade relationships. When one nation begins to impose tariffs, others scramble to avoid being the next target. But if the EU had blinked first, China wasn't about to follow suit. China had its own game plan. While the EU caved, China refused to back down. Instead, they escalated the trade war by imposing additional retaliatory tariffs and restricting the export of rare earth materials that the US relied on. China's response wasn't just a trade dispute, it was a direct challenge to Trump's economic power. The US might have been the world's largest economy, but China had its own strength to wield. Trump's response to China was just as fierce. He threatened to impose even higher tariffs, saying, "If you don't remove the tariffs, I'll raise them to 50% or even 100%. This was more than a battle of economic policies. It was a high-stakes game of chicken between two global superpowers. Both sides were dug in, with neither willing to yield. But as the conflict intensified, the rest of the world watched nervously. Would this trade war end in a mutual collapse, or would one side eventually blink? Then came the real kicker. The US found itself in a tricky situation, especially when Canada, one of its closest trade partners, decided it might be time to shift gears. Prime Minister Danielle Smith suggested that Canada could redirect its oil exports to Europe or India if the US continued to impose tariffs. Canada wasn't just playing defense. They were making a move that could shock the global energy market. The US relied heavily on Canadian oil, with millions of barrels flowing across the border every day. If Canada followed through with its plan, the US could face a crude oil shortage. The result? Higher gas prices, especially in New England, where experts warned that consumers could see prices rise by as much as 40 cents per gallon. The ripple effect was clear. Trump's tariffs on steel, aluminum, and other materials weren't just hurting manufacturers. They were putting American consumers in a tough spot too. But what about American businesses? Were they better off with Trump's protectionist policies? The answer wasn't as simple as yes or no. On one hand, U.S. car manufacturers like BMW, Audi, and Mercedes-Benz were feeling the heat of high tariffs. These companies were paying more to export vehicles to the U.S. The result, higher prices for consumers and lower sales for automakers. In a world of tight margins and intense competition, these tariffs were squeezing everyone. On the other hand, American workers were the ones who truly bore the brunt of the economic fallout. With factories closing or scaling back production, jobs were disappearing. The once thriving auto industry in the U.S. was now facing tough choices: shut down, cut production, or face massive layoffs. It wasn't just about big corporations either. Even Silicon Valley tech giants felt the pressure, losing millions in revenue as their access to the Chinese market was restricted. The result was a massive slowdown in the global economy, and in the U.S., it was the everyday workers who felt the pain the most. The biggest question in all of this wasn't whether Trump could win the trade war, it was whether he understood the consequences of his actions. Could he see that the very tariffs he imposed to protect American workers were actually doing more harm than good? And if he didn't act quickly, would he risk triggering an economic collapse? With rising inflation, increasing costs, and a shrinking job market, the situation was rapidly escalating out of control. As the trade war raged on, it became clear that the stakes were higher than ever. The U.S. economy, once a symbol of strength and stability, was now teetering on the edge. While Trump's aggressive tariff policies were intended to protect American workers and manufacturing, the unintended consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. The damage was widespread. From farmers to factory workers, the very people Trump promised to protect were now facing higher costs, job losses, and a shrinking economy. Yet amid all the chaos, one of the most significant decisions came not from Trump or his administration, but from the American automaker Ford. Ford, like many other U.S. companies, was caught between a rock and a hard place. The tariffs had driven up the cost of steel, aluminum, and even lithium, the essential component for electric vehicle batteries. Building vehicles in the U.S. was now 25% more expensive than manufacturing them overseas. Ford had no choice but to make a tough call. They decided to shift production of their Focus, CMAX, and EV lines overseas. No more factories in Michigan, no more assembly lines buzzing with workers. This was no small decision. Ford was abandoning the very land that had built its empire. Michigan, once the heart of American industry, was now witnessing the dismantling of a legacy. Trump, predictably, didn't take kindly to this move. He accused Ford of betraying American workers and promised to impose tariffs, blacklist them, and cancel federal contracts. But Ford didn't flinch. They understood the reality. They were no longer just competing with other car companies. They were up against a new kind of competition, one led by Tesla. Tesla, in many ways, had already won the battle. While Ford was struggling with unions, legacy factories, and political pressure, Tesla had built a streamlined empire that operated outside the old systems. Tesla wasn't just making cars. They were building an entire infrastructure. They mined lithium, built batteries, manufactured vehicles, and even developed self-driving AI, all in-house without the bureaucratic bottlenecks that slowed down traditional manufacturers. Ford knew it had to adapt or perish, and so they embarked on a massive transformation. Project T3 became their bold attempt to reinvent themselves for the future. They pledged to invest $50 billion, partner with BMW for solid-state batteries, and use robots to perform 90% of the assembly work. No more showrooms. No more outdated systems. The future of Ford was all about EVs that could run 1 million miles and charge in minutes. They weren't just building cars, they were building the future. But the political backlash was intense. Critics called Ford's decision a betrayal, and Trump seized the opportunity to lash out, accusing them of abandoning American workers. Yet Ford's CEO, Jim Farley, didn't apologize. Instead, he made one simple statement: do you want to lose 2,000 jobs now or 20,000 5 years from now? It was a harsh reality, but it was the truth. Ford wasn't just saving itself. It was saving the future of American manufacturing. In many ways, Ford's decision was a reflection of the larger problem facing the entire U.S. economy. The old ways of doing business were no longer enough. The world was changing rapidly, and companies like Ford had no choice but to innovate or be left behind. The question was no longer about whether the U.S. could survive in a global economy. It was about how it would adapt. But as Ford forged ahead with its bold new vision, the U.S. government was stuck in the past. Trump's tariffs were a desperate attempt to protect industries that were quickly becoming obsolete. While Ford embraced automation, electric vehicles, and new technologies, the government was still trying to prop up outdated industries with protectionist policies. This disconnect between the past and the future was becoming increasingly evident. The tariffs were doing more harm than good. While Trump thought he was protecting American workers, the reality was that these policies were causing inflation, raising costs for consumers, and putting American businesses at a disadvantage in the global race. And as more companies like Ford followed in John Deere's footsteps, moving production overseas to stay competitive, it became clear that the U.S. was on the brink of a major shift. At the heart of this conflict was a question that no one seemed to have a clear answer to. Could the U.S. continue to survive as an economic powerhouse while clinging to outdated policies? The rise of automation and global competition was forcing the U.S. to rethink its entire economic model. But the question remained, could Trump's vision for a protectionist America still work in an increasingly interconnected world? The truth is, the U.S. economy was at a crossroads. It could either adapt and embrace the future, or it could continue to fight a losing battle against the forces of globalization and technological advancement. The choice was clear for companies like Ford: adapt or disappear. But for the country as a whole, the answer wasn't so simple. And with the economy on the line, the stakes couldn't have been higher. As we look to the future, one thing is certain: America's place in the world will depend on how it navigates these shifting economic tides. Whether it's through embracing new technologies, finding smarter ways to compete globally, or understanding the interconnectedness of the world economy, the time for change is now. The only question left is whether the U.S. can move fast enough to secure its place in the global marketplace, or whether it will be left behind, a victim of its own resistance to change.